Welcome to Play the Ink. I'm your host, Zach Hale. Today we have a slightly different format on Play the Ink. On the last episode, we had pianist Ting Luo and composer Gene On. While speaking with him, I realized that Gene On had studied with Edmund Campion, who is a professor of music composition and director at the Center for New Music and Audio Technologies, known as CINMAT, at the University of California, Berkeley. In February 2016, while I was in Montreal, Edmund Campion gave a distinguished lecture at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Music, Media, and Technology, better known as CERMIT, which I was a member of at the time. The day after his talk, myself and two other colleagues, composer percussionist Preston Beebe and music technologist guitarist Ian Hatwick, sat down to talk with Edmund for our website, computermusicdesign.com. This interview, unfortunately, was never released, but stayed on my personal computer for the last 6 years. And after speaking with Gene, it made me realize that we should release this interview. So today's episode is the release of that interview with Edmund Campion on February 26th, 2016 at Kermit. I also encourage everyone as well after the broadcast to watch his Kermit Distinguished Lecture on YouTube, which we will include in this episode's notes since we reference bits of it throughout the episode. So enjoy our conversation now with Edmund Campion in 2016. So we were just picking some things, I guess, that we noticed out of your talk and then out of some interviews we read with you. And so I'm really interested in, because I did some composition as well, but you said you came from like a serial background and then you use, and tell me if I'm wrong what I'm saying, but you said there is like this floor, right? This structural thing that's underneath that's not always apparent on the surface of the music, right? The sound maybe is like the surface, and I'm just really interested if you could talk about that, like having these layers of like the structure underneath that maybe you use to get the piece happening and have the structure, but not that you want people to recognize it all the time.
Yeah, that's right.
And using patchwork for that.
Well, what I was trying to get at is that noise or frequency space when I was in my teens was really part of the culture of sound. I mean, the new synthesizers and all these things. And so that was normal. But then when I went to be formally educated, got to college, everything was about the note. Everything was about the symbolic and how to control the symbolic. And so suddenly I was in this space in which these two worlds weren't really compatible. The idea of a note and a noise, and so that's when you have a history of electroacoustic music, which seems to exist independently of other music traditions, or seems to, well, on one hand, actually wants to distance itself. And on the other hand, from both sides, someone might say, I don't do electronic music. I don't do that. I do music, or I do this. And so there's was my condition, so to speak, of these two worlds, because the more I got into higher education at that time, the more formal the approach to pitch language, it became, and even to a point of an sort of extreme, sort of ridiculous set of terms for what we called music composition, and they were always at odds. At the same time, there's a third stream in my life which was about improvisation, and I was an improviser, and so you weren't supposed to bring that to your academic space. It just was not discussed, and it wasn't allowed. It wasn't to be concerned. So when you lived in New York at that time, you'd go downtown and like participate in gallery life or improvising, and then come uptown and be this sort of serial, paper-driven, score-driven composer. And so the short part of the story is that problem for me has always is really what drives most of my interest in music now. And so trying to bind and see and understand frequency space as both a space that is symbolic and one that is analytical or frequency based. So noise and notes and all these things that I showed the Dennis Smalley sort of spectromorphology, note to noise continuum. That's pretty much describes it, and I believe in terms of audibility, noise has been lurking, I say, in the space of music all along, and so the question is, where is it? And where it is in the lower, it's in the lower amplitudes. It's in it exists down at a very low level, right? And so it's masked most of the time with traditional Western instruments, right? That go a long way to ensure that noise is under control, right? Mm-hmm. So and also in the performance practice, right? So if someone practices for years with their bow to make sure that when the bow starts, it doesn't go, mm-hmm. Right? But now we're living at a time where everybody's sort of like really interested in the and not the part of it, right? They want, so they're going into the noise floor. And they're really looking at the instrument as a potentiality, all of its potentiality for noise. But as those of us who are working in new instrument design or whatever know, those instruments really are made to be harmonic things, and they really are designed to do a certain kind of sound, and you can subvert that only so far, And so wouldn't it be nice if we had instruments that, that really were about the other thing? Mm-hmm. So.
It just brings to mind like the futurist Rousseau. I mean, does
Exactly.
he influence you at all? I mean, that's just the first person that comes to mind when you're talking about noise as being the.
Yeah. Well, I think in the Rousseau thing that's a little more, it's almost a political, social stance about, the moment he was living, and that manifesto and all that stuff about, and so that it's interesting to me, but it's very far from me. As I said, I'm a realist and really very practical. I love the noise space, and I see it as a rich compositional part of space. I also love the frequency space. I also love the idea that we can abstract sonic events into symbols and manipulate them as symbols only. Mm-hmm. So all of these things to me are really viable. As musical, it's not music; it's musical. So what I'm always interested in is what is musical in this, and what So I'm more Varesian in the sense that I'm just drawn to the thing that I don't see present. Like I'm always asking myself, well, what's missing in this picture? And so I'm always saying, well, that's where I would like to be. I think it's a function of living enough in decades to see that music does transform, that it does change, and according to the old adage, it doesn't change as fast as you think it should, and then when it does change, it's really faster than you would have imagined, like that kind of political statement. But that's true, but at the same time, it's up to people to locate, spaces of action. And if you think that it's all used up or it's all been covered, and that's just not true. It will change, and that's why I brought up the issue of Scott Joplin and the Maple Leaf Rag, all the way up to Charlie Parker and Cherokee within the course of 40 years, or even the end of Bach's life, 1750 to the end of Mozart's life, 1792 or whatever. You're talking about tremendous musical shift in a very small period of time. So it'll always be that way. So different things. So and we talked with Ian about just the notion of the borderlines of music. Right. That's really probably a more interesting discussion. Maybe this thing we call music is just about done.
Hi there again. Just a brief note. The next person you're going to hear asking a question is Ian Hatwick.
So I'm curious, you mentioned briefly in there politics and the idea that music can change. And you talked also in your lecture about this idea that it's a we who are creating music. It's not a me or I'm changing music. Yeah. But I would want to ask you, how do you view your legacy, or maybe how are you trying to help music evolve, and how do you see your place in that?
Well, I think of like all artists, you're involved in it's a personal and it's a transpersonal. So it's a private and a public activity, and this is something that you live with if you keep going with it, because you have to have a public face, otherwise you won't be able to do it. And for music, I've said it. My brother's a poet, and I've said it to him, and he says, "No, it's just absolutely not true." And what I've said to him is, "Well, I think that you actually can exist without this community of people around you." I said, "In music, it's impossible to exist without others. It is an exchange of community, and the performances and the public and all that thing. That's not something that is tangential, or it's something that's essential to the process in some ways. So for the musician composer, this personal, transpersonal interaction is like the main thing, right? And so a lot of not just me, but many composers have trouble with this. Either they're too public and they have no private agenda, right? And because they may be very successful, or whatever that means. As my wife says, successful within a circle of a very small circle. So, no, very famous within a very small circle of people. Yeah. And so this. On the other end, you can get very personal, and basically just not communicate. Okay, so for me, the trick has been, I want you to know what I've been doing. Okay, because it's 25 years I've been at it, and it's been a public thing, and but at the same time, I'm really shy, and I'm really internal, and I think this is shared by a lot of other composers that I know, and it's really hard for us to speak up and say, this is what I've been doing, actually. And so there's a kind of embarrassment quota to that, And I've just learned over the years that I have to go ahead and stick my neck out so people can cut it off, and because it doesn't actually hurt me. And so I feel like I'm serving a certain role there, and that role basically is to raise a flag that there are different ways to do this business. There are different ways to project oneself, that you don't have to conform to one current image of what it is to be contemporary, or what it is to do new things, or what it is to be the best composer in the world, or all these things. And so yes, that doesn't mean that there aren't pathways that can be filled by certain kinds of composers, right? It's not. I'm not railing against the current status quo. I love many composers, of the music of many composers that are working right now, that work within a fairly narrow idea of what music is. All I'm saying is that, well, wait a minute, can we at least acknowledge that the landscape is much broader, and we don't need to close these barriers to exchanges. And so for me, that's been in the collaborative. That's been discovering how the other arts view music, which of course is oftentimes viewed as a kind of backwater, lost tradition that they don't quite get, And then we view oftentimes art making as sort of like, well, you're just ill-informed, you don't know anything, you're sort of like you're surfing on the current moment of culture in a way that has no depth, that sort of thing, that sort of argument. Yeah.
The next person you'll hear ask a question is Preston Beebe.
I was just curious, like with the current state of the technology these days, how over these past years, these past decades, like electronic music and technology has developed so advanced, and how music also is moving really, really fast. I just was wondering what you thought about that, and
well,
how you approach it.
Yeah, I think I always liked what Xenakis had to say. There's a lot of really nice interviews with Xenakis, and he said, "I have a small mind," and he said this many times. He'll just keep repeating, "I have a small." So what is he talking about? Well, what he's talking about is that you can't do everything you'd like to do, right? You really do have to make some decisions about how you use it or what you're going to do with it, right? And Ian and I, again, we mentioned this yesterday a little bit, which was the idea of, I'll leave it to you to go away and do all these things that you're doing it, and those are wonderful activities. I have to, in my small mind, stay where I am, because I think that's the place that I live. That's the place that I've explored over the years, and so. We all think that we live in a special moment, right? That's just part of being human. I think we think, oh, this is this unique. I don't think anyone has ever, Einstein, whatever, must have felt, that this is a special moment, Or if you were right in the middle of the Second World War, it was like, there's never going to be another moment like this in history, or for the Western world anyway. But this, I kind of think it is. I think this transition to an information-based world, being a pre-internet person, it's extraordinary, and the amount of information available is also a kind of numbing feature of our lives, and so the world just was not as transparent. We really can see what's going on every day all over this globe in all these different ways, not only with scientific data, but just like we can actually just look at the cameras. We see more than the government security agencies of the 60s saw of the world. I mean, we can look at it right now. We can zoom into Tehran. We can go down on the street. The question is why? What does it all mean? Well, we're being bombarded. So for people of my generation, what it's really doing is actually unplugging. It's causing them to unplug pretty vigorously, because they can't adapt to that to those changes. It's not like a new phone arrived. It's everything. And so the generations that are growing up, your generations that are growing up in that space, I can't speak for you. I don't know who you are, and all I can do is try to not be unplugged from it and try to keep communicating, because what I find in the arts is that the older people who do not interact with young artists are the finished art. They're just not functioning anymore. So that's this issue of again, facing embarrassment of the things that I don't know or can't do, and just sitting in there and saying, well, I have to bring to you what I do know. And so it's that experience thing. It's that mentorship thing. And so in terms of, you mentioned something about legacy, I think everything right now is going to be swept away. We're going to be living in a kind of information blank. If there is a history to us in the future, there's going to be this little, like historians will come to this period and say, well, there's just not, it's really hard to figure out exactly what people had, because, for example, so-called My Music, again, none of that stuff works. It doesn't work. I'm talking about the things with technology and all this stuff. If you let it go for 6 months, it's out of it's already down the tube, So now we have some people trying to deal with that, or trying to, instead of writing max patches or whatever, you write schematics, so that someone in the future might want to. So trying to deal with the issue of repertoire, and so music has always been based in repertoire, as far as I know, Western music. But our music that we're doing today with technologies, it's very difficult for it to be based in repertoire, because it's a slippery thing, So.
Yeah, it's true. Like how when designing patches for our compositions, it's interesting to think about, will this survive? Like with all these operating systems changing, and the patch worked in this OS, but now we're in this OS. Oh, my computer just died, so now I'm forced to upgrade.
They won't survive.
Yeah,
there's no.
That's
but and that's in terms of, if someone's really worried, that's that personal transpersonal discussion. If I were really worried about so-called, like, how I might be viewed or legacy, I would just say I've blown it, and because none of this stuff is really it's liquid. It's just gone. But some people are trying to change that, and it really is in the we. So if I'm working with a researcher who's really dealing with trying to form, like you said, good practice or agile programming in Max or whatever it is, really trying to create some practices which can lead to real continuity across the thing, instead of getting away from this personal environment. This is my thing, and my friend and colleague David Wessel, who passed away 15 months ago, is really one of the pioneers of all this. He lived in such an environment too. We talked about, he had several computers, and so when he wanted to work in a piece that, some area that he had to go back to, the 2010 computer or the 2000 computer, and use that, and OS 9 even, or whatever it was, because the driver, all of the associated dependency technologies were no longer viable. So to try to port all that over is like a whole life in itself.
So do you think that pieces should be written on a hardware, for a specific hardware, that you send the piece, for example, with that hardware?
Yeah. So again, that's a fairly traditional view of music, right? The idea that I give the materials to you, the performer. I don't know you, and through those schematics, you're able to go and do the work, and so that works quite well with that. Let's forget the technology, and let's say the new music concert we heard last night, or if you heard that last night over here at McGill. There's an ensemble. The musicians are trained. They get the score. There's probably a lot of it in the score, a lot of notational problems that they don't understand, but they make some decisions and pretty much are able to realize the work. Add in some piece of technology, and underneath that piece of technology is a whole technical web of stuff that has to go with it. So one of the pieces I heard last night they had to have 60 microphones on the stage. Now where is that going to come from in any kind of reasonable communication space, right? So no ensemble is going to be able to do that again. That's just not possible. So those are just very, very practical aspects of technology, not even talking about the platforms or the programming and that sort of thing. So yes, if you accept a sort of this traditional space, then you're going to have to narrow what you're giving. And I think the best example I know of this is Kayasariaho, who you take a piece like Noah Noah, which is a very well-known piece for flute and max patch, and it involves some real-time processing, which is like basically infinite reverb and off of a microphone capture. And so and then it has the pedal, right? So it's sort of a little paradigm, right, that we lived with for about 12 years, where it's a pedal piece with a max patch and a live performer, and the live performer does the technology. Okay, so that piece is performed at least 150 times a year right now. According to Jean-Baptiste Berrière, it's done every day somewhere. And so that paradigm shows that within that with that kind of narrowing of scope, you can have repertoire, right? And so as long as Jean-Baptiste Berrière makes sure that the max patch is concurrent with the current systems and all that, anybody can get it, they can get the sheet music, and they can play the piece. But what Kaya reports is that when she wrote the piece, she was really not thinking that way. She was really working in a kind of IRCAM view, which was, like having a lot of different input from a lot of different people and having a huge production facility, right? So the kind of sounds that she imagined coming from this flute, the flautist on Noa Noa, and the voices and all this, you have to think of the espace projection and IRCAM and the multi-channel sound. That's the way the piece was conceived. And so she says now she goes and she sees people taking the piece and playing it like it's the Furelise or something, and she's again transpersonal personal. She has to live with that and thank everybody for for playing the music. But there's a disconnect between what she had, if I have it correct, I don't mean to speak for her, but this is what in conversation. And so in the case of my own works, I try to do the same thing, except that try to put it into a package where the MaxPatch is a standalone application. It loads everything it needs. It comes with an ability to add a microphone. It comes with its own reverb and effects processing, and it's very transparent and easy to use. It's just robust. It doesn't cause it. It's plug and play, and so that way the pieces are played. But in my case, they're most of the pieces that I wrote in the 90s. They're pieces that I have almost no interest in personally anymore, and so I become sort of the caretaker of a couple of older pieces. So that's another issue, So again, in the public-private way, that I have to sort of either be saddled with something that I did in the past and have to help people. That's the one they want to do, because it's easy and it works and it had, so.
I found myself thinking during this whole discussion that we're artists most of the time when you're working, you're not necessarily thinking about what's going to happen down the road with this, and you're not thinking about posterity or you're thinking about, this is a problem I'm interested in the moment. These are the tools I need to realize this problem. And that this was true, probably is true of every artist's practice, and it probably was true of composers in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. So the idea that we have this written notation, which to us looking back feels like a legacy that they've gave to us, was really a derivative of their daily practice.
Absolutely.
So for us as computer musicians, our daily practice is working with max patches, and we don't know how those are going to be viewed in the future, whether they're even going to be able to be accessed. But we just, we don't know.
Yes, as I said, the change is a lot slower than you would imagine it should be, right? And that's because we're a small community, actually. Mm-hmm. And there still are a lot of people that play violins out there in the world, and they still do it in a pretty traditional way. And so those are larger communities, and those scores that circulate and are played, and they serve larger communal social functions that we're not necessarily doing. We have more micro communities around this stuff, and then I would say that individually, privately, yes, you're working in Max or some environment, and you're programming daily, and you're in your case working with hardware and maybe even building hardware and that sort of thing, which is a very broad set of activities. I would say the main activity of today, and I just always say this, which is who are you collaborating with, and because I can't do, I've reached my limit in terms of my ability to do technology. All I can offer to a developer or a researcher is that I'm somebody who has the experience and enough knowledge of technology to actually participate with you. And so I don't have any illusions about what technology might do to the situation. I'm really like, I understand the limits of what's going on, and I understand that a researcher might really be interested in something very abstractly related to communication between machinery, and that's a really fascinating problem. And so the question in collaboration is how do we share and come up with something, right? How does that person make progress, and how do I make progress in terms of this issue of, well, I have a deadline, I have an ensemble that I'm going to sit down with in a month, and we're going to actually do this thing, right? And so the culture of like, what the IRCAM called the musical assistant, I guess it's called a réalisateur now or something. Informatique musicale. And the issue of accreditation, like who does the work, who gets credit for what, and so these old cultures collide and usually say, well, it's the composer, and then it's Ed Campion did this, and then suddenly my collaborators called me up and said, why, you've locked me out of the project. How could you do that? I said, I didn't do that. I made every effort. I have to go back and show the emails. This is what we do, and this is how we do it. And they still put, it in the old traditional accreditations. They just don't have a model for like concerts for how to credit people who are major contributors to a project. So I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
and so but it has been a learning process to figure out, where do you credit, because if you just take the SynMat spectral objects, we call them, like sinusoids or resonator tilde, and then you start mining it for the kind of roots, the racine, like who's responsible for this thing, then it just becomes this endless thread of people that you can't even detangle it anymore, because you realize, oh well, this goes all the way back to like the first experiments at IRCAM about issues of resonance, and so it's hard to collaborate, hard to credit collaboration, hard to recognize that this old image of the composer as being the chief visible is just totally dysfunctional. So.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about some of your pieces where you have these open environments for the performer to improvise in part of it, and like I know when you improvise, like who's really whose material is that?
That's right.
And you lay down these parameters and for them to work around, and
they're more like, as I call them, flight instructions, right? And so the piece that I would say represents mostly that is the piece. It's called Korai. It means choral, sea choral, and it's for a saxophone and interactive max patch. And inside the max patch, it's fiddle tilde is the analysis engine. So there's Miller Puckett, and then it's a wrapper around that fiddle tilde, and from that it jumps to a bunch of pattern matching spaces, which were not mine. They were I defined them, I laid them out, but the engineer and developer was Matthew Wright, And then Matt, who's head of technical direction now at Karma in Stanford, with Korai, he solves so many problems of gain management. Because if you're going to give an environment to a player and they're going to control everything, right? You don't want to have, there's not going to be a Wizard of Oz person back there actually fixing the problems that the player, no, it really is turn it on, it's your environment. There's all of these issues about what they're generating and how it's being added into the space, and then how the various gains are being handled. And so what kind of control of gain can you give the performer, right? So how closely can their own gain envelopes, amplitude envelopes control the space? Well, that's a real serious problem in terms of how to articulate, how to model that. And Matt Wright really solved that for me. And so there's all kinds of little, well, it's a whole list. It's a laundry list of problems. That's what that piece is. And so first, it's the viability, the reliability of analysis. Okay, so how much can you count on with fiddle tilde? How much can you count on with something like the Antiscofo engine or Sigmund or whatever? So we're always moving from different, analyzer tildes, another. But with fiddle, there's a pretty large degree of error that you're going to have to live with. It's not just a beautifully cooked pitch world, right? No, it's a bunch of data that you've got to average. You've got to look at it and figure out, if you're going to believe it or not, and that sort of thing. And for the composer, you're going to have to figure out, what's your margin of error in terms of what you're going to let happen. So I would say that, as it is with a lot of the works that I've done, I only just took the first step, because I could have spent my whole life doing Korai-like work. And by now, if I did that, you would know me primarily as someone who did these environments, and they would be really, really kind of hot, But I've never been that kind of person, because what I do is I change. I want to move. I don't. Even though I love doing that work, I don't want to be so narrow in my approach. I wanted to see what was possible by doing it. And also, I had some specific performance things in mind. For example, with Korai, it was part of a ballet originally that was commissioned by IRCAM, and that ballet had the musician on the stage with the dancers. So it was a wireless microphone, and the dancers don't think of musical structure the way musicians do. So they know score, and I didn't want them counting really precise things. And so the idea was to give them an environment to allow the saxophonist to project a kind of architectural sound space that they danced in. And so that was the origins of it. It was very practical in its origin. What it ended up being, as I said, was a very sophisticated sort of gain control management system, a fairly robust analysis system, which was fiddle-based, and then a number of pattern matching groups of patterns. And so it was something, what we were doing is saying, well, if there's silence, how much silence? If it's in this register, what register? If it's at this level in amplitude, how, then you're good to go. And so that would create a new strike of something, right? So the player then becomes someone who negotiates all of these different patterns, and this reflects right back on the player as well, because they don't get to be themselves anymore. They realize that they are a controller, and so they have to play accordingly, and this changes the way they play, not just what they play, but how they play, and so they can make fiddle work a lot better if they play a certain way, right? And so this is an interesting part of the work that I've done over the years too. It's recognizing how much you alter, maybe disturb performance practice, and then you have to go back and think about how your work with technology, might be better served in another way. Like, for example, my history with click tracks. I really am not trying to promote click tracks. I just don't have another way to do what I've been doing. And so it's pretty, I don't like putting those on musicians' heads. But I think we're close to being, to having a way to not need click tracks.
Yeah. There's also these vibrotechnical
That's what I'm saying,
things. Yeah.
There's a number of things coming now which could solve that problem, but it does require the research, the funding,
Exactly.
and for example, like wireless. If you're going to have dynamic tempo maps between many musicians that are spread out over space, and you want to get them all in some sort of coordinated clocks through network systems, well, there you go. I think you're probably dealing with that.
There's at least several projects in our lab that are dealing with exactly that.
Exactly.
And there's a commercial company just released tactile metronome Soundbrenner.
Oh.
And one of the people involved in the development of that was from our lab as well. So it's very near and dear to our interests.
Oh, well, I'm going to ask you about that more because I want to.
It's mobile, and you can use like a mobile app. Yeah, we're gonna promote it now.
But you can actually sync up, or But those networks are just so unreliable, and so many times I've thought, okay, well, we're just going to use the router, and I've ended up stringing a long Ethernet cable because it's just like you walk into a hall and everybody's cell phone shows up, and then everything goes timing
goes to hell.
Crazy. And
really. I always
so that robust reliability issue. That's
Perry Cook in his paper, and he was talking about principles of instrument design. One thing he said is, I always paraphrase this: the only thing worse than wires is wireless.
Yeah, but maybe that's only temporary. Maybe that's going to be solved.
Well, I've definitely found as an instrument designer and a hardware developer, at this point in history, your wireless is the way to go, but it's a challenge. It still is not a solved challenge. It's something that really requires attention and focus to meet those challenges that it presents. But it's the way of the future. It's what we expect, and it offers so many possibilities, which are really wonderful. So you really do want to embrace those.
I mean, think about cell phones. I'm sure, in the 60s or 70s, you talk about cell phones. Well, that was only like, that was really unreliable technology. I mean, and now everybody has it. Right. So it's time with anything, cooks and figures itself out.
That's right. It will happen. In the 60s, the stopwatch was a very, very functional musical instrument, and it worked pretty good. And so today it doesn't, to me, that's fine. If we all have to sit, the four of us get together with our stopwatches and say 3, 2, 1, boom, and then walk to our corners, we're going to be pretty much synced in terms of human time needs. And so the question comes about the scale, like at what scale of precision are you talking about here? And so I've been interested. That's what I've been interested as a composer in those areas of the spectrum of something like timing. That's just not occupied by other composers. So in this case, let's say what is precision in timing, right? In terms of human timing, and what difference does it make? What are we trying to do if we try to get 4 people to actually do something simultaneously? And we know that it's not simultaneous at a certain scale, but maybe at a perceptual scale it's good enough, right? So music is full of the good enough, and in fact that's called expression. Temporal notions of clock precision are pretty they're germane to our time in some way because we're watching clocks everywhere and their precision, but I'm not sure that I don't know what their ultimate musicality is. So I think that's an interesting thing. That's where the conceptual, I'm really interested as a composer in the art aspect of which is questioning grids and questioning even chaotic spaces or distribution or whatever it is you're doing with time, trying to both do it and watch yourself doing it, so that you question that's what I consider to be art making. We're not naively putting stuff together. We're actually weirdly self-aware, but we still make stuff. So we're both observing and doing, and that's what I call the doing problem right now. So
it was about when we were talking about, I guess, error in the interactive environment you said you were creating. Because I worked with Analyzer this summer on some things, and what I found was interesting is, like, maybe if you compose the piece knowing that there might be error, like a way to maybe do so, like if this doesn't work, then repeat this until it does work. Or, I mean, do you think that that's something that maybe we could do as composers, or is
that's what I did do. That's what Korai is, and so Korai, the only way you can play that piece badly is if you think I'm going to do this and you're going to do that in response. No, you're going to do. You have a set of patterns that the computer understands or doesn't, so it may be hard of hearing. And also they're all simultaneous, so they're all overlapping systems. And so you may be making something happen that you're not conscious of, like because you've actually satisfied some other pattern that you weren't intending, so to speak. So intention of the player has to let go of intention, and they have to fly. And flying means that they do all of it at once. And when they do that, what I found in the pieces, I don't know, at least done with 15 different saxophonists that are all either jazz trained or like free improvisers, are totally classical trained. Susan Fancher, totally French-style classical saxophonist who took the piece up as well and recorded it. And but what everybody reports is that they absolutely love doing it, that they get, it starts talking to them, and they start talking to it, and then they realize that it's them, that they're projecting themselves into some larger sphere, and that they don't have full control, they don't have intention in that sense, but they can, like a boat on a sea, they can tack, and they can go this way and they can go that way, and if they rough things up too much, it might get a little rough out there, but then they can calm it down and start over again. So all of those things are based in an error, an acceptable window of error, and that's been part of all of my environments that use sort of interactive electronics. Otherwise, it's just too dangerous to try to. The Boulesian notion of perfection, of score perfection following, and all that kind of stuff. I think that might just be, that's an aesthetic choice to some degree, and again about exercising intention and control with the electronics, which is a good goal too, I suppose. And but the flexibility, the ability to recover. I mean, all of us you as a performer know that, you don't walk on the stage and do 100%. You're in the process of recovery all the time. You got to get really good at that. It's like,
And I've played pieces with score following where it doesn't follow me, and then you're
exactly.
kind of like, just hit the pedal.
That's right. That's right. Well, we did Entame 2 with Antiscofo a few years ago, and I'm not disparaging Antiscofo, which I really respect and think is an incredible thing in a lot of ways. But we had to do that. We had to sit back at the computer and start launching.
Spacebar.
Yeah, because we couldn't get it to follow correctly. So.
Yeah, I'm really interested in things happening in real time. In allowing, if you have different performers to approach the piece, how they can have their input, instead of having pre-recorded sound files of some other performer, and then they have to match that. It just, I feel like when things are in real time and live, like it really allows the performer to bring it to their level. It's like how someone would interpret a Bach sonata, where there's no dynamics written, So how would they, interpret the dynamics and bring it to their level and having their own input? And I don't know what.
Yeah, I agree that the search for a real-time aesthetic, is extremely important. And a mistake that a lot of people make is well, I'm going to do this thing in real time, and yet there's no aesthetic underpinning to that relationship of what you mean by why you're doing it that way. And so you just gave the best one, which is this performer involvement, feeling of owner of authority to the space. That is something that I think is really a good place to start with real time. But what's happened historically is that the advent of real time sort of stole away this notion of the composer that's doing all this pre-compositional and planning. And so I think Entame2 is a really good example of like something that I wouldn't recommend be real time, because it's so precisely composed that I would prefer that a piece like that be a piece for violin and orchestra and just be conducted, because it would just be so much more beautiful, and instead of all of this, complicated technical interaction, which I don't think adds up to a real-time aesthetic. And nothing emerges out of that I would say is specifically fascinating about the real-time space. It seems to be, it was an older idea. It took a long time to realize, and I don't know that we're going to have a lot of pieces that work that way. Does that make sense in terms of a notion that all of these technologies, and certainly, of course, real time is not the word we want to use, right? Something's got to happen between the space of real time, which is what it's more like just closer to real time, and but it takes away It takes away this large-scale formal memory thing that's been part of music composition for a long time. And so naturally, it has really found a home with improvisers and, environments with people who are both performers, maybe doing their own Max environments. I'm thinking of Frank Grotowski, who has been working over the last few years. He's just an amazing improvising musician, and he's been working in Max and learning how to program and building with Arduino, adding stuff to his instrument. And, to me, this is a real-time aesthetic. He's got some very compelling personal need with his own sense of his own identity as a musician to do this. So I had something similar in the 90s when IRCAM asked me to do the NatCell project, which was, I wanted an environment that was made for my playing, myself as a keyboardist. So I'm not a pianist in the sense that I wouldn't play Boulez's piano sonata. I'm a pianist in the sense that I have a lot of improvisational skill, and I use the piano as a composer. So trying to create an environment in which I could explore improvisation and interaction with Max. There was no MSP at the time. Was really natural for me, and so then it became continuity, how to keep it alive, And I'm really happy to say that 20 years later, I still have the environment. It's modular. I can open it up. I can play it. I can adapt it to other artistic collaborative spaces, and so it is working. So at least from a personal sense, the thing is that I'm going back to the Frank Grotowski comment. You have to have a real reason you want to be there, and in my case, the improvisation is a wonderful companion with more formal compositional thinking. because I like flexibility, and I like and being an improviser keeps me mentally, it keeps me closer to real time and makes me not be so detached from musical material when I'm working with it. And so that really is integrated. The part that's not integrated is when I really get into hard programming problems, and I'm trying to solve things for myself, which would really be better solved by people who are like you, or really have a much higher level engagement or interest in let's say quality, best practice, good, solid, rigorous programming skills. And I'm still one of those people that can program, but it's going to, you know, it's somewhat laughable from someone who's really an expert, you know.
You know, I have this sinking feeling that most people who program feel that way about their own code.
Yeah.
There's always someone higher than you that can do it better.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've run with some pretty high-minded coders, and so over at Berkeley, there's just, you know, they sort of rule computer science. So the you know, again, that's that. Early on, I said something about the embarrassment of the public, you know, and being able to say, well, okay, well, I'll walk into your domain and go ahead and show you that I don't know anything, but that I've done the best I can with it. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, sometime you come over into my field, and we'll see how you do. You know, of course, they don't think they need to do that, because why would they want to do? You know.
Why would I want to write music?
Exactly. That's just.
Well, they would be too embarrassed. So thinking about the aesthetics of real time, I found myself going back to our earlier discussion about noise, and thinking about, for me, one of the aesthetics of real-time computer systems and interactive computer systems is dealing with the situatedness of music. And again, this is something that somehow formal notation and sort of formal composition attempts to minimize in some ways. Mm-hmm. And the ability to interact with the environment, the physical, spatial, acoustic environment, the social environment, the ensemble environment, the realities of playing an instrument in which you're really coupled with this very complex system, and letting those things be part of the focus and the interest of the work. Mm-hmm. I think that's something that really benefits from a real-time thought
Absolutely.
process.
That's part of it. Yeah, that's part of that aesthetic issue. Absolutely. Yeah. And
this brings to mind, I've seen Pero Lunaire a couple times, and I've seen it in a huge hall, you know, for an orchestra, and I've seen it in a coffee shop that was like so small everybody could barely fit in there. And I loved the coffee shop. And if you think when it was written, it was for like a cabaret setting, right?
Yeah.
So I guess in that way too, like you imagine the space, and then you have to, it's almost like a historical context too, maybe sometimes.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's, you know, the oppressive concert hall, it really is, it can really be bothersome. But at the same time, maybe, you know, it's not like tear it down. It's not really a Marxist argument for the, you know, the end of the. It's not a Stockhausen thing, like we will bury you, and you know, it didn't happen. So the thing is that it should exist. It exists for a good reason. It is, I think, in some ways connected to, you know, a more religious view of how we're gonna treat sound in that space, right? So we're gonna treat it with respect. We're gonna conform to the space of that culture, and most people do, right? No matter how you feel about a piece of music, you know, you're not really doing the classic early 20th century riot thing these days, right? Like, I'm not sure anybody would be that impressed if a bunch of people stood up and started screaming at the, you know, disrupted a concert. Everybody would just say, you know, first of all, why did you, you know, it wouldn't be controversial, and it wouldn't help anything, right? So the concert hall exists in a beautiful way still. It's a place. It's a site. There's something you can do there. And I think what the McGill New Contemporary Music Ensemble did last night is an example of that, a great use of the concert hall, which is what it's for. Mm-hmm. But again, I find that a little narrow. Is that the only place that composers and musicians and should work? No, of course not. And so not just public places, like you said, the coffee shop thing, which gives you a completely different perspective on Pierrot, right? But also just much more extended situations for the kind of knowledge that we bring as composers and musicians, how to translate that into other situations so people get an idea of what it is we're doing. The art world, for example, seems to be stuck on John Cage as sort of the end of any notion of what sort of new music is, and that's a sort of a function of history in a way, but it's sad to me. It's sad because we split off. They gave up on systems at a certain point, the way that we seem to be our technology and these kind of things as well. So I often find myself trying to reestablish some sense of discourse with people in the arts, as I said.